The 10 Keys That Explain the New World System. Ignacio Ramonet. He is a Spanish journalist, professor of communication theory established in France and one of the main figures of the alternative world movement. The 10 Keys That Explain the New World System. How is the New World System? What are its main characteristics? What dynamics are determining the real functioning of our planet? What characteristics will dominate in the next 15 years, between now and 2030? To try to describe this new world system and foresee its immediate future, we are going to use the compass of geopolitics, a discipline that allows us to understand the general game of the powers and evaluate the main risks and dangers. To anticipate, like on a chessboard, the moves of each potential opponent. What does that compass tell us? The decline of the West. The main finding is, the decline of the West. For the first time since the 15th century, Western countries are losing power in the face of the rise of new emerging powers. The final phase of a 5-century cycle of Western domination of the world begins. The international leadership of the United States is seen threatened today by the emergence of new poles of power, China, Russia, India, on an international scale. The strategic declassification of the United States has begun. The American century seems to come to an end, while the European dream is fading. Although the United States remains one of the world's leading powers, it is losing its economic hegemony to China. And it will no longer exercise its lone military hegemony as it has since the end of the Cold War, 1989. We are heading towards a multipolar world in which the new actors, China, Russia, India, have the vocation to constitute solid regional poles and dispute international supremacy with Washington and its historical allies, United Kingdom, France, Germany, Japan. In the third line now appear a series of intermediary powers, with rising demographics and strong rates of economic growth, called to also become regional hegemonic poles and with a tendency to transform, in 15 years from now, into a group of planetary influence: Indonesia, Brazil, Vietnam, Turkey, Nigeria, Ethiopia. To get an idea of the size and speed of the Western downgrading that is coming, it is enough to point to these two figures. The share of Western countries in the world economy is going to go from 56% today to 25% in 2030. That is, in less than 15 years, the West will lose more than half of its economic preponderance. One of the main consequences of this is that the United States and its allies will no longer have the financial means to assume the role of gendarmes of the world, in such a way that this structural change could succeed in lastingly weakening the West. China's unstoppable emergence. The world is de-Westernizing and is increasingly multipolar. It highlights, once again, the role of China that emerges, in principle, as the great power in the making of the 21st century. Although China is still far from representing a real rival for Washington. On the one hand, the stability of the Middle Kingdom is not guaranteed because the wildest capitalism and the most authoritarian communism coexist within it. The tension between these two dynamics will cause, sooner or later, a break that could weaken its power. In any case, today, in 2016, the United States continues to exercise undisputed hegemonic domination over the planet. Both in the military domain, fundamental, and in several other increasingly determining sectors, in particular, technology, internet, and soft power, mass culture. This is not to say that China has not made prodigious progress in the last 30 years. Never in history has any country grown so much in such a short time. For the moment, while the power of the United States declines, the rise of China is unstoppable. It is already the second economic power in the world, before Japan and Germany. For Washington, Asia is now the priority zone since President Obama decided on the strategic reorientation of his foreign policy. The United States tries to stop China's expansion there by surrounding it with military bases and relying on its traditional local partners, Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, the Philippines. It is significant that Barack Obama's first trip, after his re-election in 2012, was to Burma, Cambodia, and Thailand, 3 states of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, ASEAN, an organization that brings together Washington's allies in the region, most of whose members have maritime boundary problems with Beijing. The seas of China have become the areas with the greatest potential for armed conflict in the Asia-Pacific area. Beijing's tensions with Tokyo, regarding the sovereignty of the Senkaku Islands, die out for the Chinese. And also the dispute with Vietnam and the Philippines over the ownership of the Spratly Islands is dangerously escalating. China is modernizing its navy at full speed. In 2012, it launched its first aircraft carrier, the Liaoning, and is building a second, intended to intimidate Washington. Beijing is less and less supportive of the U.S. military presence in Asia. Between these two giants, a dangerous strategic mistrust is taking root that, without a doubt, could mark international politics in this region between now and 2030. Jihadist terrorism. Another of the global threats that our compass indicates is the jihadist terrorism practiced yesterday by Al-Qaeda and today by the Islamic State Organization or Daesh, ISIS, in English. The main causes of this current jihadist terrorism must be found in the disastrous mistakes and crimes committed by the powers that invaded Iraq in 2003. In addition to the nonsense of the interventions in Libya, 2011, and Syria, 2014. The Middle East continues to be the current disturbing focus of the world. In particular around the inextricable civil war in Syria. What is clear is that, in that country, the great Western powers, United States, United Kingdom, France, allied with the states that most spread an archaic and retrograde conception of Islam throughout the world, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Turkey, decided to support, with money, weapons, and instructors, the Sunni Islamist insurgency. The United States established a broad Sunni axis in that region with the aim of overthrowing Bashar al-Assad and thus depriving Tehran of a great regional ally. But the government of Bashar al-Assad, with the support of Russia and Iran, has resisted and continues to consolidate. The result of so many mistakes is the current jihadist terrorism that multiplies the hateful attacks against innocent civilians in Europe and the United States. Some Western capitals continue to think that massive military power is enough to bring down terrorism. But examples abound in military history of great powers unable to defeat weaker adversaries. It is enough to remember the North American failures in Vietnam in 1975, or in Somalia in 1994. In an asymmetric combat, the one who can do more does not necessarily win. Historian Eric Hobsbawm reminds us that in Northern Ireland, for nearly 30 years, British power proved incapable of defeating an army as tiny as the IRA's. Certainly the IRA did not have the advantage, but neither was it defeated. Conflicts of a new type, when the strong confront the weak or the mad, are easier to start than to end. And the massive use of heavy military means does not necessarily make it possible to achieve the desired objectives. The fight against terrorism is also authorizing, in matters of governance and domestic policy, all authoritarian measures and all excesses, including a modern version of democratic authoritarianism that targets, beyond the terrorist organizations themselves, to all the rebels and protesters who oppose globalizing and neoliberal policies. There is a crisis for a long time. Another important finding, the rich countries continue to suffer the consequences of the economic financial earthquake that was the 2008 crisis. For the first time, the European Union, and Brexit confirms it, sees its cohesion and even its existence threatened. In Europe, the economic crisis will last at least another decade, that is, until at least 2025. We say that there is a crisis, in any sector, when some mechanism suddenly stops acting, begins to give way and ends up breaking down. This rupture prevents the whole machinery from continuing to function. This is what is happening in the world economy since the subprime crisis broke out in 2007 to 2008. The social repercussions of this economic cataclysm have been unprecedentedly brutal: 23 million unemployed in the European Union and more than 80 million poor. Young people in particular are the main victims, generations without a future, but the middle classes are also scared because the neoliberal model of growth leaves them by the wayside. The speed of the financial economy today is that of lightning, while the speed of politics, by comparison, is that of a snail. It is increasingly difficult to reconcile economic time and political time, and also global crises and national governments. All this provokes, in the citizens, frustration and anguish. The global crisis produces losers and winners. The winners are found, essentially, in Asia and in the emerging countries, which do not have such a pessimistic view of the situation as that of the Europeans. There are also many winners within Western countries whose societies are fractured by inequalities between the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. In reality, we are not enduring a crisis, but a bundle of crises, a sum of crises mixed so intimately with each other that we cannot distinguish between causes and effects. Because the effects of some are the causes of others, and so on until they form a true system. In other words, we are facing a genuine systemic crisis in the Western world that affects technology, the economy, trade, politics, democracy, identity, war, the climate, the environment, culture, values, the family, education, youth, etc. From the anthropological point of view, these crises are resulting in an increase in fear and resentment. People live in a state of anxiety and uncertainty. The great panics are returning in the face of indeterminate threats such as job loss, technological electroshocks, biotechnologies, natural catastrophes, generalized insecurity. All of this constitutes a challenge for democracies. Because that terror is sometimes transformed into hatred and repudiation. In several European countries, and also in the United States, this hatred is today directed against the foreigner, the immigrant, the refugee, the different. Rejection of all others, Muslims, Latinos, Gypsies, Sub-Saharans, undocumented people, etc., is on the rise, and xenophobic and far-right parties are growing. Disappointment and disenchantment. You have to understand that, since the financial crisis of 2008, from which we have not yet emerged, nothing is the same anywhere. Citizens are deeply disenchanted. Democracy itself, as a model, has lost credibility. Political systems have been shaken to the roots. In Europe, for example, the big traditional parties are in crisis. And everywhere we perceive rises of formations of extreme right, in France, Austria, and the Nordic countries, or anti-system and anti-corruption parties, Italy, Spain. The political landscape appears radically transformed. This phenomenon has reached the United States, a country that already knew, in 2010, a devastating populist wave, embodied then by the Tea Party. The eruption of the billionaire Donald Trump in the race for the White House prolongs that and constitutes an electoral revolution that no analyst knew how to foresee. Although, apparently, the old bias folly between Democrats and Republicans survives, the rise of a candidate as heterodox as Trump constitutes a real earthquake. His direct, popular style, and his Manichaean and reductionist message, appealing to the lower instincts of certain sectors of society, have given him a character of authenticity in the eyes of the most disappointed sector of the right-wing electorate. In this regard, the Republican candidate has been able to interpret what we could call the base rebellion. Better than anyone else, he perceived the widening divide between the political, economic, intellectual and media elites, on the one hand, and the conservative electorate base, on the other. His violently anti-Washington bureaucracy, anti-media, and anti-Wall Street discourse seduces, in particular, white voters, poorly educated and impoverished by the effects of economic globalization. Earthquakes and more earthquakes. In this respect we could say that another great characteristic of the New World System is earthquakes. Financial, monetary, stock market earthquakes, climatic earthquakes, energy earthquakes, technological earthquakes, social earthquakes, Geopolitical earthquakes such as the re-establishment of relations between Cuba and the United States, or, in another sense, the recent institutional coup d'état in Brazil against President Dilma Rousseff. Electoral earthquakes such as the recent victory of the No in Colombia to the peace agreements between the government of Juan Manuel Santos and the FARC, or the recent Brexit in the United Kingdom, or the success of the extreme right in Austria, or the defeat of Angela Merkel in several partial elections in Germany. Or the enormous earthquake that could effectively constitute the eventual electoral victory of Donald Trump in the United States. Unforeseen events break out with force without anyone, or almost no one, having seen them coming. There is a general lack of visibility. If to govern is to foresee, we are experiencing an evident crisis of general governance. In many countries, the state that protected citizens has ceased to exist. There is a crisis of representative democracy. They don't represent us, said the outraged. The people demand that the political authority once again assume its leading role in society. It insists on the need to reinvent politics and for political power to limit the economic and financial power of the markets. Internet, cyber espionage, and cyber defense. The New World System is also characterized by the multiplicity of strategic ruptures whose meaning we sometimes do not understand. Today, the Internet is the vector of most changes. Almost all the recent crises have some relation to the new communication and information technologies, with the generalized dematerialization and digitization, and with the unprecedented explosion of social networks. More than a technology, the Internet is therefore a fundamental actor in crises. Just remember the role of WikiLeaks, Facebook, Twitter and other social networks in accelerating information and social connectivity throughout the world. Between now and 2030, in the New World System, some of the largest communities on the planet will no longer be countries but communities gathered together and linked to each other by the Internet and social networks. For example, Facebookland, more than 1 billion users. Or Twitterland, more than 800 million. Whose influence, in the Game of Thrones of world geopolitics, could prove decisive. Today, power structures are becoming blurred thanks to universal access to the Internet and the use of new digital tools. On the other hand, due to the close complicity that some great powers have established with the large private companies that dominate the computer and telecommunications industries, the capacity for mass espionage has also grown exponentially. Mega companies such as Google, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, and more recently Facebook have established close ties with the state apparatus in Washington, especially those responsible for foreign policy. This relationship has become an evidence. They share the same political ideas and have the same vision of the world. Ultimately, the close ties and common worldview of, for example, Google and the U.S. administration serve U.S. foreign policy goals. This unprecedented alliance, state plus military security apparatus plus giant web industries, has created a veritable surveillance empire whose clear and concrete objective is to put the Internet under surveillance, the entire Internet and all Internet users, as denounced by Julian Assange and Edward Snowden. Cyberspace has become a kind of fifth element. The Greek philosopher Empedocles argued that our world was made up of a combination of 4 elements: earth, air, water, and fire. But the emergence of the Internet, with its mysterious interspace superimposed on ours, made up of billions of digital exchanges of all kinds, by its roaming, its streaming, and its clouding, has spawned a new universe, in a quantum way, that comes to complete the reality of our contemporary world as if it were a true fifth element. In this sense, it should be noted that each of the 4 traditional elements historically constitutes a battlefield, a place of confrontation. And that the states have had to develop specific components of the armed forces for each of these elements, for the land army, for the air force, for water, the navy, and, with a more singular character, for the firefighters or fire warriors. Naturally, since the development of military aviation in 1914 to 1918, all the great powers are today adding, to the 3 traditional armies and firefighters, A new army whose ecosystem is the fifth element, the cyber army, in charge of cyber defense, which has its own organic structures, its general staff, its cyber soldiers and its own weapons, supercomputers prepared to defend cyber borders and carry out digital cyber warfare in the internet environment. A mutation of capitalism, the collaborative economy. 30 years after the massive expansion of the web, consumption habits are also changing. Little by little the idea that the smartest option today is to use something in common, and not necessarily buy it, is prevailing. This means gradually abandoning an economy based on the submission of consumers and on antagonism or competition between producers, and moving on to an economy that stimulates collaboration and exchange between users of a good or service. All this poses a true revolution within capitalism that is operating, before our eyes, a new mutation. It's an irresistible move. Thousands of digital platforms for the exchange of products and services are expanding at full speed. The amount of goods and services that can be rented or exchanged through online platforms, whether paid or free, such as Wikipedia, is already literally infinite. On a planetary level, this collaborative economy is currently growing between 15% and 17% per year. With some absolutely spectacular growth examples. For example, Uber, the digital application that connects passengers with drivers, in just 5 years of existence is already worth $68,000 million and operates in 132 countries. For its part, Airbnb, the online accommodation platform for individuals that emerged in 2008 and has already found a bed for more than 40 million travelers, is worth today on the stock market, without owning a single room, more than $30,000 million. That is, more than the big Hilton, Marriott, or Hyatt groups. In this regard, another fundamental feature that is changing and which was nothing less than the basis of the consumer society is the sense of property, the desire for possession. To acquire, to buy, to have, to possess were the verbs that best translated the essential ambition of a time in which having defined being. Accumulate. Things, houses, cars, refrigerators, televisions, furniture, clothes, watches, books, pictures, telephones, etc., constituted for many people the main reason for existence. It seemed that, since the dawn of time, the materialistic sense of possession was inherent in the human being. The collaborative economy is therefore an economic model based on the exchange and sharing of goods and services through the use of digital platforms. It is inspired by the utopias of sharing and non-commercial values such as mutual aid or conviviality, and also by the spirit of gratuitousness, the founding myth of the Internet. Its main idea is, what's mine is yours, that is, sharing instead of owning. And the basic concept is barter. It is about connecting, digitally, people who are looking for something with people who offer it. The best known companies in this sector are Uber, Airbnb, Netflix, BlaBlaCar, etc. Many signs lead us to think that we are witnessing the twilight of the second industrial revolution, based on the massive use of fossil fuels and centralized telecommunications. And we see the emergence of a collaborative economy that forces, as we have already said, the capitalist system to mutate. On the other hand, in a context in which climate change has become the main threat to the survival of humanity, citizens are not unaware of the ecological dangers inherent in the globalized hyperproduction and hyperconsumption model. There too, the collaborative economy offers less aggressive solutions for the planet. At a time like the present, of strong distrust towards the neoliberal model and towards the political, financial, media and banking elites, the collaborative economy seems to provide answers to many citizens in search of meaning and responsible ethics. It exalts values of mutual help and desire to share. All criteria that, at other times, were mortar of community theories and socialist ambitions. But today they are, make no mistake, the new face of a mutant capitalism eager to get away from the ruthless savagery of its recent ultra-liberal period. Our compass also points out the appearance of tensions between citizens and some governments in dynamics that several sociologists describe as post-political or post-democratic. On the one hand, the generalization of Internet access and the universalization of the use of new technologies are allowing citizens to achieve high levels of freedom and challenge their political representatives, as during the crisis of the Indignados. But, at the same time, these same electronic tools provide governments, as we have seen, with an unprecedented capacity to monitor their citizens. Non-military threats. Technology, says a recent CIA report, will continue to be the great leveler, and future Internet tycoons, as could be the case of Google and Facebook, have entire mountains of databases, and manage in real time much more information than any government. For this reason, the CIA recommends that the U.S. administration deal with this possible threat from large Internet corporations by activating the Special Collection Service, a top-secret intelligence service, managed jointly by the NSA, National Security Service, and the SCE, Service Cryptologic Elements, of the Armed Forces, specialized in the clandestine collection of information of electromagnetic origin. The danger of a group of private companies controlling all this massive data lies mainly in the fact that it could condition the large-scale behavior of the world's population and even government entities. It is also feared that jihadist terrorism will be replaced by even more daunting cyber-terrorism. The CIA takes this new type of threat all the more seriously that, in the end, the decline of the United States was not caused by an external cause but by an internal crisis, the economic bankruptcy that occurred in 2007 to 2008. The report insists that today's geopolitics must be interested in new phenomena that do not necessarily have a military character. Well, although military threats have not disappeared, some of the main dangers facing our societies today are of a non-military nature: climate change, technological mutation, economic conflicts, organized crime, electronic warfare, depletion of natural resources. Regarding this last aspect, it is important to know that one of the resources that is being depleted most rapidly is fresh water. In 2030, 60% of the world's population will have water supply problems, giving rise to the appearance of water conflicts. As for the end of hydrocarbons, instead, thanks to the new hydraulic fracturing techniques, the exploitation of oil and shale gas is reaching exceptional levels. The United States is already almost self-sufficient in gas, and in 2030 it could be in oil, which tends to lower its manufacturing production costs and encourages the relocation of its industries. But if the US, currently the main importer of hydrocarbons, stops importing oil, it is to be expected that the prices of a barrel will fall. What will be the consequences then for the big exporting countries? Towards the triumph of the cities and the middle classes. In the world we are heading towards, 60% of people will live, for the first time in human history, in cities. And, as a consequence of the accelerated reduction of poverty, the middle classes will be dominant and will triple, going from 1,000 to 3,000 million people. This, which in itself is a colossal revolution, will bring about, among other effects, a general change in culinary habits and, in particular, an increase in meat consumption on a planetary scale, which will aggravate the environmental crisis. In 2030, the planet's inhabitants will be 8.5 billion, but the demographic increase will cease in all the continents except Africa, with the consequent general aging of the world's population. Instead, the link between human beings and prosthetic technologies will accelerate the development of new generations of robots and the appearance of supermen capable of unprecedented physical and intellectual feats. The future is rarely predictable. This does not mean that we must stop imagining it in perspective terms. Preparing ourselves to act in the face of various possible circumstances, of which only one will occur. In this respect, geopolitics is an extremely useful tool. It helps us to become aware of the rapid developments underway and to reflect on the possibility, for each of us, to intervene and set the course. To try to build a fairer, more ecological, less unequal, and more supportive future. Finish. The 10 Keys that Explain the New World System. Ignacio Ramonet.